In front of millions of viewers, Joni Lamb's entire world collapsed on camera. Nobody was prepared for Joyce Meyer's brutal surprise. It makes Joni unable to speak and compels Daystar to do a very negative action. Silence for years was broken. Public humiliation erupted from private issues. It's more than simply a disaster. A religious media power has completely collapsed. At last, the truth is emerging. You won't believe how deeply ingrained this untruth is. First of all, Joni Lamb looked like the perfect boss. It was simple to see her smile, pray, and stand in front of the cameras. It was her serene strength that people clung to. After her husband Marcus Lamb passed away, she ran Daystar in a way that many people found appealing. She was viewed as a strong, devout woman who persevered through the storm. Behind the scenes, however, something was changing. Silently at first, then definitely. Those who worked at Daystar were witnessing changes. Before she started making all of her own decisions, Joni was renowned for being approachable and cooperative. She had to process a lot of little things, such as pictures, invites, and clothing. Individuals who had previously felt like they were a member of a team began to feel like background noise. If you questioned a decision or proposed an alternative, you might be transferred or excluded from crucial meetings. It wasn't exciting or noisy. Though everything was quiet and sluggish, it was taking place. Those who used to feel like family and had worked there for years now had to be careful. The discussions grew more circumspect. Some of the ideas were toned down or non-existent. What drew them together was sharing the religion and improving lives, but it seemed like something else was replacing it. Keeping Joni in command. At home, things weren't any better. Her son Jonathan, who had always accompanied her to church, began to distance himself. He had been raised in the Daystar universe. He believed that to be so. But with time, he began to feel less like a child and more like a worker. Their once warm and trusting relationship began to seem strained. The debates continued. People became aware that he was missing TV shows and public gatherings. People who used to visit Jonathan once a week began to inquire, "Where's Jonathan?" At church functions, Joni continued to raise her hands, smile, and say the appropriate things. However, those who knew her well believed that something was off. Her grin was not always met by her eyes. It appeared as though the joy had been practiced. When people tried to speak to her, it seemed as though she wasn't actually listening. She was more concerned with being in command than with the objective. Meetings behind closed doors started to focus more on appearances than functionality. Rather of imagining fresh ways to contact people, they were preoccupied with scores, numbers, and appearance. It was no longer about God's plan, the staff began to declare. Getting Joni's approval was the goal. A few of them departed gradually. Some stayed in the hopes that things would improve. Outside the building, the noise level of the comments increased. Rumor had it that Joni was more interested in establishing her own company than in God's kingdom. Some contributors began to question whether their funds were actually being used for services or only to maintain Joni's platform. Those who had always supported her began to reconsider. However, the reports weren't difficult. The gap between Joni's on-screen persona and her off-screen persona was widening. Although she continued to be in control, speak, and pray, she lacked the warmth that distinguished her as a leader. People could see the wall had cracks in it. For a while, Joni tried to remain composed. She believed that if she was in control of everything, things would stop collapsing, so she tightened her hold on them. She made a concerted effort to hold on, but she kept losing her grip. Relationships deteriorated, staff members felt confronted, and her bond with her own kid grew worse every day. The distance between their true feelings and how others perceived them had become too great to conceal. For the first time, many who had previously believed that Joni was unbreakable started to question whether she had lost sight of the objective. Was God still at the center? Or had everyone turned their focus to Joni? People began to realize that the scene they watched on television wasn't exactly correct. Those who were aware of the reality in the quiet areas of Daystar, behind the scenes, were tired of pretending it didn't exist. For a long time, Joyce Meyer and Joni Lamb were regarded as two of the most significant figures in contemporary Christian media. They stood side by side at conferences, prayed together on the radio, and supported one another through difficult times. Those who saw them knew of their friendship and admired them as strong, devout ladies. However, everything changed when Joyce Meyer took a risk that nobody had anticipated. When she did speak up, it wasn't just because she disagreed with a well-known person. It was a shock to every religious community. Joyce had been seeing Joni for a while. She was deeply disturbed by what she saw. It was not about that choice or that time. The transition was tough and gradual. Joyce had always respected Joni's management of Daystar, particularly following the passing of Marcus Lamb. She was struggling with great loss and trying to keep her church and family together when she encountered the woman. However, Joyce was unable to deny the changes she witnessed over time. What she had once referred to as a sister in faith was beginning to change about the Joni. She was growing increasingly protective, domineering, and preoccupied with maintaining her public persona rather than fulfilling the ministry's mission. Joyce initially made an effort to remain silent. She didn't want to go public or cause a stir. She wasn't like that. Instead, she picked up the phone. Late at night, she tried to contact the former buddy by calling Joni. She reminded her of their common objective of serving people, not platforms, and gently conveyed her concerns with her. However, Joni seemed unconcerned each time Joyce brought it up. She either ended the conversation, made vacuous promises, or shifted the topic. Nothing changed, and Joyce's sense of helplessness grew. Joyce was also hearing stories, not just rumors, from those who had previously known Joni, worked at Daystar, or were close to the family. They discussed how decisions were made without prayer, how many were terrified at work, and how the mindset had shifted from cooperation to only following orders. Those who devoted their lives to the church and loved Daystar now felt alienated. They heard that Joni was quick to push away anybody who didn't follow the rules, was control-obsessed, and wouldn't listen to criticism. At first, Joyce didn't want to believe it, but as she heard more, she became increasingly certain that something was seriously up. Months passed while she prayed. She prayed to God for intelligence. She was aware that if she told everyone, everything would be different. Not just for her and Joni, but for Christian media in general, their missions, and the people who backed them. It would be painful. It would break. She would pay for it. But she was aware of something worse. If she said nothing, she would be guilty. She was unable to accept that. One day, Joyce organized a small gathering. She kept the news staff in the dark. It was not reported to the media. With her Bible in hand, she stood in a quiet room and spoke. Her voice was not angry. It was peaceful, powerful, and incredibly depressing. She described her observations. She discussed how Joni had altered her leadership style and how the church appeared to place more emphasis on appearances than on religion. She described how the loss of significance in favor of power made her heart ache. She remarked, "I have loved Joni like a sister. However, I can't remain silent when I witness someone using God's work to flaunt their abilities." Those were really painful statements. Despite their simplicity, they had great meaning. Joni wasn't being made fun of by Joyce. What she had lost made her unhappy. She was very clear that she didn't want to damage herself or get even with him. They did it to safeguard the calling they once shared. Demonstrating the love of Christ is the aim. She explained to everyone that serving others, being humble, and relinquishing control are more important for leaders in God's kingdom than clinging to power. The response was immediately apparent. Some were taken aback. They were shocked that Joyce would criticize Joni. It was like being misled to them. For the first time, however, many others felt noticed. People who worked for Joni suddenly felt as like someone was listening to them when they felt like they couldn't say anything. Even preachers who had concerns about Daystar's course began to voice their opinions, as did former employees and donors. They related their own tales. They concurred with Joyce's statement. The wall of silence that had protected Joni eventually started to crumble. Naturally, people retaliated. Fans of Joni rallied to her defense. According to them, Joyce mishandled the matter. They claimed she was discussing personal matters in public. They claimed that Christians shouldn't handle conflicts in this manner. Joyce, however, did not give up. She didn't respond. She did not retort. She simply stated that in order to recover, it is critical to speak the truth, even if it is painful. She continued to pray for Joni in the hopes that her words would serve as a wake-up call rather than an attack. Christian news sites started to cover it as soon as she spread the word. It was discussed on blogs, YouTube channels, and podcasts. Churches across the nation discussed the situation in lectures. It sparked more extensive discussions about accountability, authority, and what it means to be a trustworthy church leader. People began to raise difficult concerns, not only about Joni Lamb but about all the spiritual leaders they adhered to. Had they grown too accustomed to celebrity, or did they truly wish to spread the word? Within Daystar, the spread effect was extremely powerful. It became charged and hushed when the staff met. To get answers, people began sending emails. Donations decreased. Participation by partner departments ceased. Joni was asked to quit her employment by several people. A lot of people prayed for her return. But the atmosphere had shifted. Although everything appeared to be flawless, there were now too many cracks to overlook. Joyce, however, remained calm throughout. She didn't intend to harm Joni. It was made obvious. She remained confident in Daystar's ability to perform. She simply didn't believe that power and fear should be the foundation. She didn't aim to offend anyone. They were intended to heal, to illuminate dark areas, and to remind everyone, especially those in positions of authority, that everyone can be corrected. In the weeks that followed, more stories surfaced. Others stepped forward. The previously concealed fact was suddenly public knowledge. Although it was painful, it created space for something better. Genuine responsibility, sincere reflection, and the opportunity to truly recover. Joyce was taking a risk by doing what she did. She was saddened, but everyone was reminded of something straightforward yet powerful. Sometimes the finest thing you can do for someone you love is to be honest with them. Joyce's singing was a ray of light during a gloomy period. She was courageous and demonstrated what courage looks like to religious people. She reminded everyone that while speaking up isn't always easy, remaining silent to defend malfunctioning systems is far worse. When she did that, she wasn't only criticizing a friend. She urged all Christians to keep in mind the fundamentals of leadership. Not beauty or strength, but honesty, humility, and faith. More than just Christians were very troubled by Joyce Meyer's public remark. Daystar was deeply hurt. For the ministry, hiding from the impending storm was no longer an option. It had previously offered strong religious programs, hope, and solidarity. Almost overnight, the atmosphere in the Daystar facility seemed to shift. It became chilly, tight, and uncertain instead of feeling like a family or simply a safe haven. For years, many Daystar employees had questioned whether they were the only ones who didn't enjoy their professions. A few felt as though they were being pushed aside. Others had witnessed talented colleagues being let go without explanation. Because they feared losing their jobs if they ever questioned Joni's decisions, many people were reluctant to speak up. However, everything changed when Joyce Meyer's remarks were televised. The silence had vanished. There were now uncertainties and potential outcomes. Longtime employees who had always liked Joni were suddenly conflicted. They reflected on the woman who instructed the team to focus on God's plan and prayed before each significant meeting. They reflected on how Joni had sustained the network following Marcus's passing. For those folks, the possibility that she was mistaken was painful and difficult to accept. Joyce's remarks simultaneously brought back memories they had attempted to ignore. I recall stressful sessions where ideas were shot down without cause and people looked at one another when someone stated something incorrectly. Suddenly, those were no longer strange times. They appeared to be indicators of a more serious issue. People chatted more freely after initially speaking slowly. Staff members would ask, "Did you see the video?" There was a lot of uncertainty, silent conversations, and incomplete phrases in the office. Even those who had never met Joyce could sense the significance of her words. "Do you remember that meeting from last year when maybe Joyce wasn't wrong?" Observers also started to notice the difference. A few of them had been Daystar viewers for years. They had watched shows with friends and family, contributed money, and prayed with Joni over the TV. But they began sending emails with challenging queries. Is this real? What's going on behind the scenes? Joyce was the target of ire from some spectators who said she was stirring up trouble. Does Daystar's mission still center on evangelization or power protection? Some thanked her and said they had known something wasn't right for a long time but didn't know how to explain it. On social media, there was a lot of talk, support, backlash, and misunderstanding. Some people couldn't stop talking once they started. The Daystar executives were suddenly scrutinized closely. Board meetings became tense. Joni was asked to clarify things, explain how decisions are made, and respond to questions from funders and partners. Some board members strongly defended her, calling the entire situation a spiritual attack. Others pushed for transparency, checks, and accountability. Some people voiced their support for Joni, but most remained silent in the hopes that things would improve. Some stopped donating money. Some began searching for other organizations to work with. It was rapidly turning into a public spiritual issue, and they didn't want to be caught in the middle. Joni's family also felt the stress behind closed doors. Somehow, her children had always been part of Daystar, but now their roles felt weak, and most of all, Jonathan was caught in the middle. He had worked closely with his mother for years, but now he was hearing concerns from respected colleagues who were saying that things might have gone too far. He had to decide between remaining faithful to his mother and maintaining the integrity of the company his family had built. The topics Joni and her children were becoming painful and louder. People were crying. They didn't want Daystar to fail, but they couldn't ignore the growing divide between what the ministry claimed it was and what it had become. The family was dispersed. The church struggled to continue because of the dispersed staff. Fear was a daily occurrence in the building. Some employees quietly started to leave, writing farewell notes to friends. Others kept their heads down, unsure whether or not to speak. Volunteers stopped coming as frequently. The interns were excited when they started, but now they were talking in the break rooms, unsure of what they were getting into. The name Daystar used to mean something significant and powerful, but now it just meant confusion. Joni made an effort to continue. As usual, she spoke calmly and steadily on the radio, but it was clear that she was under a lot of stress because her eyes were tired. Her posture had changed from confident to forced, and she talked about prayer and her faith, but even fans who watched every episode could tell something wasn't right. What the public thought was crucial. Every glance, headline, and email that asked, "What's really going on?" made Joni feel it. Even those who still loved her began to doubt her. They reflected on the woman who had supported them during their grief and loss and who had contributed to the establishment of a global ministry, but the person they saw now appeared guarded, afraid, and protective. They didn't trust Joyce, but they couldn't ignore the questions that were beginning to form in their minds. There was damage everywhere. Partnerships broke down, donations plummeted, churches that used to air Daystar programs went silent, and the controversy was discussed daily on blogs, podcasts, and Christian media sites. What started out as a private friendship turned into a public showdown that the entire nation was watching. The message was no longer being discussed, and everyone at Daystar felt as though they were losing sight of their mission. It was once a place of prayer and planning, but now it was full of stress, doubt, and quiet sadness, but there was still hope. Some staff members gathered to pray for restoration in private, and some team members began to wonder how they could get back to God's work. At that point, something real began to grow again, not because they were proud or powerful, but because they were hurt and in dire need of healing. The fallout wasn't just about one Daystar leader, it was about what happens when a church loses sight of its goals. It was a difficult lesson in what happens when you take charge instead of asking, but one thing that became clear was who was willing to face the truth and who still believed that God could make something positive out of bad things. It was still unclear if Daystar would survive. One thing was clear, though. The people who lived inside were no longer quiet. And when they were honest, there was finally room for change. Years ago, Joni Lamb stood tall in the middle of Daystar and kept the church together with poise and confidence. Many people around the world looked up to her after her husband Marcus died as an example of strength, faith, and endurance. But when the Joyce Meyer scandal broke out and the tensions inside Joni hit a peak, she had to face something she hadn't really thought about before. The possibility that she might need to let go. Joni could feel everything falling apart when she wasn't in front of the cameras or the starlight. She could see the fear in her employees' eyes and hear the weariness in their words. She could also feel her family growing apart from her. She no longer felt the same way about the mission she had once given her all to. No longer were meetings about coming up with new ideas or ways of seeing things. They were meant to fix things. Joni was physically exhausted, but she was also mentally and spiritually exhausted. She had worked hard for a long time to keep the ministry running, telling herself it was for God, Marcus, and the people watching, but when she was alone and quiet, she began to think about it. Did she still lead from her faith? Was she just trying to survive? Late one night, she was in her office alone, and the building was nearly completely silent. The donors calling with difficult questions, not partners who were excited to work together. The things said on social media hurt. The texts were extremely hurtful. She shut off the lights and let the soft glow from the monitors around her bounce off the walls, feeling as though the screens that used to show worship services and global mission were reminding her of what was slipping away from her. She didn't open her Bible for days because she didn't believe, but because she didn't know how to deal with what was happening. She had prayed repeatedly for God to fix it, shut up the haters, and bring back what had been lost, but the answers didn't come the way she expected them to. That night, as the building hummed in silence, Joni opened her Bible again, and this time, the words struck her in a different way. She didn't turn to a particular phrase, she didn't do anything with the pages, and instead came across Psalm 46 verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." In the days that followed, Joni made the hardest decision of her life and began to meet with her children, top staff, and trusted advisors to keep things quiet. That didn't make them feel like encouragement to keep going. Instead, they gave her the impression that they were quietly telling her to give up, stop trying to control everything, and stop holding on to the version of herself she had worked so hard to maintain. Finally, after a long time, she let herself be honest with God and with herself, and she cried, not just sad or angry tears, but tears of freedom, that she had not done so in years. For the first time, she didn't try to control or protect the story. That's right. She said she knew what she did wrong. She spoke in a trembling voice, but it was real. There was no plot or spin, just the truth. Many people in the room cried with her, and some people sat there in silence, unsure of how to react to what they were hearing. Some people didn't believe them because of what they had been through, but the most important thing was that the wall was collapsing. Joni had built walls around herself to prevent herself from seeing the damage, and those walls were collapsing.